I should have stayed quiet that night, but silence has a cost, and I was already too broke to afford it. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of Romano's like it was trying to get in and warn someone, maybe me, maybe him. I tightened my grip on the tray as I stepped between tables, balancing 4 glasses of sparkling water, my wrists aching after a 10-hour shift that was supposed to end 2 hours ago, but didn't, because rent doesn't wait, and neither does life in a city that charges you for breathing. I remember thinking how everything looked too perfect that night, the lighting too warm, the music too smooth, the kind of atmosphere rich people paid for to pretend nothing bad ever happened to them until it did. Table 12, that was where it started. VIP section, roped off like the rest of us, didn't exist. Men in tailored suits, voices low, controlled, not loud, but sharp, like something hidden underneath their words. I wasn't trying to listen. I never tried to listen. That was rule number 1. In places like this, you hear nothing, you know nothing, you survive. But then one phrase slipped through the noise, just enough to catch in my chest like a hook. They're in position. I slowed without meaning to my feet, still moving, my mind already racing. Position for what? Another voice responded, calm, almost bored. Timing has to be exact. I placed the glasses down carefully, my hands steady, even though my pulse wasn't. And that's when I saw him for the first time. Dominic Russo. He didn't enter like other men. He didn't need to. The room adjusted around him. Conversations softened. Eyes shifted without anyone being told. He was just there, tall, composed, dark suit like it had been cut just for him, which it probably had. His presence wasn't loud, it was absolute, like gravity, and standing next to him, close enough to touch his arm, was her, the girlfriend. Flawless smile, perfect posture, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to be seen without ever looking like she tried. I should have walked away. I should have gone back to the kitchen and finished my shift and forgotten everything. But then she moved, just slightly, turning her head not toward him, but toward the reflection in the window, and I saw it, the smallest nod, almost invisible unless you were already looking, and I was already looking, because something felt wrong in my bones, like the air had shifted a second before a storm hits. And suddenly everything made sense. The words, the tension, the way staff had been rotated tonight like pieces on a board. This wasn't coincidence, this was arranged. My stomach dropped. I kept moving, kept serving, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. If I stayed quiet, nothing changed. I'd go home, count my tips, and wake up tomorrow like nothing happened. If I didn't stay quiet, I didn't know what would happen, but I knew it wouldn't be small. I found a pen in my apron, my fingers trembling, just enough to notice, not enough to stop me. I grabbed a corner of an order pad, something disposable, something forgettable, and I wrote fast before I could think too much, before fear could catch up to me. Your girlfriend sold you out there in position. The words looked unreal, even to me, like I was stepping into a story I didn't belong in. I folded the paper once, twice, small enough to hide in my palm. And then I walked back, toward table 12, each step heavier than the last, my breath shallow, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I told myself I was just doing my job, just another round of service, just another table. But when I reached him, when his eyes lifted to meet mine for the first time, everything else disappeared, and I knew in that exact second I wasn't just carrying a tray anymore. I was carrying a choice that was about to change everything. I told myself not to hesitate, because hesitation was how people got noticed. And being noticed in a room like this was the fastest way to disappear. I stepped closer to him, the weight of his attention settling over me. Before I even reached the edge of the table, his eyes were darker, up close, not empty, not cold, just precise, like he was always measuring, always calculating. I set the glass down in front of him, carefully, my fingers steady, even though everything inside me was not. And as I leaned in just enough to make it look natural, like I was adjusting the placement of the napkin, I let the folded paper slip from my palm into his hand. The contact lasted less than a second, skin against skin, warm, controlled, intentional. He did not react, not even a flicker, not even a question. His girlfriend continued speaking beside him, her voice smooth, effortless, like she owned the moment, like she had already won. I straightened up immediately, my heart pounding so hard I was sure someone could hear it across the room. And I walked away without looking back, because that was the rule. Never look back when you do something you are not supposed to do. I made it 3 steps before I felt it, that shift in the air, not loud, not visible, but they're like pressure building before a storm breaks. I kept moving toward the kitchen, pushing through the double doors into the controlled chaos of clattering plates and rushing voices, but everything sounded distant, like I was underwater. I grabbed the edge of the counter, steadying myself, pretending to check an order, while my mind replayed every second. Did he understand? Would he believe me? Did I just make the biggest mistake of my life? I risked one glance through the small window in the door back into the dining room. Dominic had not moved, his posture the same, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested casually on the table, and the paper was gone. I swallowed hard, trying to breathe normally, trying to disappear back into the rhythm of work, but something had already changed. One of the men standing near the entrance shifted slightly his position, adjusting by inches. Another near the bar turned just enough to scan the room. Without making it obvious, it was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. But I was looking now. I could not stop looking. And then Dominic moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small motion of his hand reaching for his glass, lifting it, taking a slow sip, like nothing in the world had changed. But his eyes lifted for a fraction of a second and found mine through the reflection in the glass door, and in that moment, I knew he had read it. I knew he believed it, because something in his gaze was no longer neutral. It was focused, sharp, awake, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him. I looked away immediately, my chest tightening as I forced myself to turn back to the kitchen, to keep moving, to keep breathing, because whatever was about to happen, I was already part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. Minutes stretched longer than they should have, every second pulling tight with anticipation. The restaurant continued like normal. Orders called, plates served, laughter filling the air. But underneath it all there was something else, something quiet and controlled, like a plan unfolding in real time. I carried another tray out, forcing my steps to stay even, my expression calm. And when I passed table 12 again, I did not stop. I did not look directly at him, but I saw enough. His girlfriend was still smiling, still talking, still unaware, and Dominic sat there listening, his presence unchanged to anyone else, but not to me, not anymore. Because now I could see it, the way the room had shifted around him, the way every movement now connected to him, like invisible threads pulling tight. And, for the first time that night, I realized something that made my breath catch. This was never about whether he would survive. This was about what would happen to everyone else once he decided to act. And I had just become the reason he would. I kept telling myself to stay invisible, because invisible people do not get remembered, and remembered people do not stay safe. But the moment had already passed where I could go back to being invisible. I moved through the dining room like I always did, tray in hand, eyes down, steps measured, but everything felt different now, like I had crossed a line I did not know existed until I stepped over it. The air was heavier, the silence between conversations stretched just a little too long, like everyone was waiting for something they could not see. I passed table 12 again, this time close enough to hear her laugh, soft, controlled, perfectly timed, like she had rehearsed it. Her hand rested lightly on Dominic's arm, fingers relaxed, confident, possessive, and for a second I wondered if she knew, if she could feel that something had shifted beneath her feet the way I could. Dominic leaned back slightly, his posture easy, almost bored, but his eyes were not bored. They were alert, not scanning the room directly, but catching reflections in glass, in polished silver, in anything that gave him angles without turning his head. It was subtle, it was precise, and it was terrifying, because it meant he had already adjusted, he had already moved pieces I could not even see. I forced myself to keep walking into the next section of tables, taking an order, nodding at a couple celebrating something small, their voices warm, normal, grounded in a world that suddenly felt very far away from mine. I wrote down their order, even though I barely heard it. My mind was still back there, replaying every detail, every glance, every shift of posture, because now I understood something I had not understood before. Power was not loud, it did not need to announce itself, it changed things quietly until the entire room bent around it, and Dominic Russo was that kind of power. I carried the order back toward the kitchen, but slowed near the hallway that led to the restrooms, just for a second, just enough to catch a reflection in the mirror on the wall. Behind the bar, his girlfriend had moved her chair slightly closer to him, her body angled in a way that looked intimate, but her eyes were not on him anymore. They were flicking toward the entrance, toward the exit, toward the windows, counting, checking, confirming, and my stomach tightened, because I knew that look now. I had seen it before in smaller ways, in people trying to control a situation before it slipped away. She thought she was still in control. She thought whatever was coming was still hers to command, and that was the moment I realized how dangerous this really was, not because of what she planned, but because of what he would do once he finished understanding it. I stepped into the kitchen again, the noise hitting me all at once, orders being called, plates sliding across stainless steel, voices overlapping. But even here something felt off. One of the line cooks who had been here all night was suddenly gone, replaced by someone I did not recognize, wearing the same uniform, but standing just a little too still, like he was waiting, not cooking, not Rushing, just waiting, my breath caught for half a second before I forced it back to normal. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe my mind was connecting dots that were not really there, but then the back door opened, briefly letting in a rush of cold air, and I saw another man outside, not a customer, not staff, just standing there looking at his phone, but not really looking, and I knew I was not imagining anything anymore. This was real, all of it was real, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I grabbed another tray, because standing still was not an option. Moving was safer. Moving meant I still belonged to the role of a waitress, and not whatever else I had become. I pushed back through the doors into the dining room, and the moment I did, I felt it again, that invisible shift, like something had just clicked into place. Dominic was no longer leaning back. He sat forward slightly, his hand resting near his glass, his expression calm but focused, and across from him his girlfriend finally looked at him directly, her smile still there, but tighter now, like she was starting to sense the ground moving beneath her, without understanding why. Their eyes met for a second that stretched longer than it should have. And I felt my pulse spike, because whatever happened next would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would be controlled, deliberate, final. And I realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten, I did not just warn him, I changed the outcome of something I was never supposed to be part of, and there was no stepping out of it anymore. Time did not slow down the way people say it does. It sharpened everything instead, every sound, every movement. Every breath became too clear, like I was seeing the world through glass that had just been wiped clean. Dominic lifted his glass again, but this time he did not drink, he just held it there for a second longer than necessary, like he was measuring something invisible across the room. His girlfriend watched him closely now, her smile still in place, but no longer effortless. It was tighter, controlled, like she was adjusting to something she could not fully understand. Yet I moved between tables, pretending to check on guests, asking if they needed anything. My voice steady, my hands steady, everything about me normal, except nothing felt normal anymore. I passed the entrance and noticed one of the men who had been standing there earlier was gone, not left, not dismissed, just gone, replaced by someone else who looked almost identical in posture and presence, in the way he stood, just slightly angled toward the room, like he was part of the space instead of inside it. And that was when it clicked. This was not reaction, this was preparation. Dominic had not just believed the note, he had already moved before anyone else realized the game had changed. I felt my chest tighten as I stepped toward the bar, picking up another order I did not need, just to give myself something to do, something to hold on to, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing how deep I was already in it. I glanced again toward table 12, this time, not directly, but through the reflection of a mirrored column. Dominic's hand rested on the table, fingers relaxed, but positioned just so, like he could move in any direction without hesitation. His girlfriend leaned in slightly, saying something I could not hear, but I saw. The moment her expression shifted just a fraction. Too long a pause, too careful a look, like she was waiting for a response that did not come. And then he spoke. I could not hear the words, but I saw her reaction, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her smile flickered and came back thinner, like she was correcting herself in real time, like she realized something was not going the way she expected. And that was when the tension broke, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a thread pulled too tight, finally giving way. One of the men near the bar adjusted his position, stepping just enough to block a line of sight. Another near the hallway turned slightly, his attention no longer casual, but fixed, and Dominic finally set his glass down, the sound soft against the table, but somehow louder than everything else in the room, because it marked something, a decision, a moment that could not be undone. I stopped breathing for a second, without meaning, to my body going still, even as I forced myself to keep moving, because whatever was about to happen, it had already begun. His girlfriend noticed it too. I saw it in her eyes, the way they sharpened, the way she leaned back, slightly scanning the room in a way that was no longer subtle, no longer controlled. She knew now. Not everything, but enough to understand that she was no longer the one in control. Dominic stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled movement that drew attention without demanding it. Conversations around them continued, people laughed, glasses clinked, music played, but the space around their table felt different, like the air itself had shifted, and for the first time that night, I felt something else, not fear, not exactly. Something deeper, something colder, the realization that power did not explode, it closed in, it adjusted, it removed options until there was only one path left, and you did not even notice until you were already on it. I took a step back, instinctively, my grip tightening on the tray as I watched from a distance I should not have been watching, but I could not look away. Dominic leaned slightly toward her, saying something quiet, something only she could hear, and whatever he said made her freeze completely. Not for long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. I saw the exact moment she understood, and in that second her eyes flicked across the room, searching, calculating, trying to find a way out that was no longer there. And then Dominic turned his head just slightly, not toward her, not toward anyone else, but toward me, across the room, through reflections, through movement, through everything, and our eyes met for half a heartbeat, and I knew with absolute certainty I was no longer just a witness. I was part of his decision now, and whatever came next would not leave me untouched. I did not realize I had stopped moving until someone brushed past me and muttered, "Excuse me," and I blinked like I had just come back from somewhere far away, the tray in my hands suddenly heavier than before, like it was the only thing keeping me grounded in a world that had already shifted beyond recognition. Dominic was still standing, but now he was no longer part of the room. He was the center of it. Everything else moved around him, adjusted to him, responded to him. Without a single command being spoken, his girlfriend rose slowly from her chair, her posture still elegant, still composed, but there was something underneath it now, something strained, like she was holding herself together by forcible rather than confidence. I could see her eyes moving again, scanning, calculating, searching for someone or something that was no longer where it was supposed to be, and that was when I understood the plan she had trusted had already unraveled before it even began. Dominic had not raised his voice, he had not made a scene, he had simply shifted the balance, and now the entire room belonged to him in a way it had not. Just minutes before, I forced myself to step forward again. Because standing still was no longer an option, I had to keep playing my role, had to keep moving like nothing had changed, even though everything had. I approached another table, asking if they needed anything, my voice steady, my expression neutral, but my attention pulled back again and again toward him like gravity. I could not escape. He turned slightly, speaking to one of the men beside him, his tone low, controlled, but whatever he said triggered movement, immediate, precise. The man nodded once and stepped away, disappearing into the crowd like he had never been there at all. No panic, no urgency, just execution, like a plan already written, now being followed exactly as intended. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I realized how deep this went. This was not a reaction, this was a system, a network of people who understood without explanation, who moved without hesitation, who acted without question, and I had just inserted myself into the middle of it without knowing the rules. Dominic's girlfriend took a step back, now her smile gone, completely replaced by something sharper, something colder, like she was finally revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface. Her eyes locked onto his face, searching, demanding answers. He gave her none, at least none that I could see, but whatever passed between them in that silence was enough, because she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering, just slightly, not in relief, but in understanding, like she had reached the end of a calculation and did not like the result. I felt my heartbeat spike again as I realized this was the moment, not loud, not dramatic, but final, the moment where everything tipped, and there was no going back. I turned away, quickly forcing myself to focus on the table in front of me, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, anything to keep my hands busy, because if I stopped, if I let myself think too much, I would freeze, and freezing was not safe here. Nothing about this was safe anymore. I could feel it in the way the staff moved, now more cautious, more aware, even if they did not know why. Something in the air had changed, something they could not name, but could not ignore either. And then I heard it, not a shout, not a command, just my name, quiet, but clear, cutting through the noise of the room like it had been placed there specifically for me. Emily. I froze for half a second before turning slowly, because I already knew who it was before I even looked. Dominic stood a few feet away, now closer than he had been all night, his presence overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with control. His eyes held mine, not harsh, not demanding, just certain, like he had already decided something, and I was simply catching up to it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the tray as I stepped toward him, because not stepping was not an option anymore, not after everything I had done, not after the choice I had made. "You work here," he said, his voice low, even measured, but there was something underneath it, something that made it clear this was not a question. I nodded, once my throat too tight to trust my voice, and for a second, he just looked at me like he was seeing something beyond what I showed, something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken in a way I did not understand. And then he spoke again, just as calm, just as controlled, but this time the words landed differently. "You should not have done that." I felt my breath catch, my mind racing to find an answer that would not make things worse. But before I could say anything, he added something else, quieter, but heavier, and I am glad you did. And that was the moment I realized whatever happened next, I was no longer on the outside of it looking in. I was already part of his world, whether I wanted to be or not. His words did not sound like praise, and they did not sound like a warning. They sounded like something in between, something heavier, something that settled into my chest and stayed there. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because what could I possibly say that would make sense in a moment like this? I just nodded again, small, controlled, careful not to draw attention, even though it already felt like the entire room was tilting toward us. Dominic watched me for another second, like he was waiting for something more, like there was a version of this conversation that could have gone differently if I had said the right thing, but I did not know what that was, and maybe he already knew that too. He glanced past me briefly toward the rest of the dining room, and when his eyes returned to mine, something had shifted again, not colder, not warmer, just decided. Stay close, he said quietly, the words simple, almost casual, but the meaning behind them was not casual at all. I felt my pulse jump instinctively, every part of me wanting to step back, to put distance between us, to return to the safety of being just another waitress moving between tables, but my feet did not move, because I understood something now. Distance was not safety, not anymore, not after what I had done, not after what I knew. I swallowed and adjusted my grip on the tray, trying to steady myself as I nodded once more, staying where I was, because leaving felt more dangerous than staying, and that realization alone made my chest tighten. He turned slightly, then his attention shifting away from me, but not entirely, like I was still within his awareness, even when he was not looking at me directly. His girlfriend stood a few feet away, now no longer beside him, no longer part of his immediate space, and the distance between them felt deliberate, like a line had been drawn without anyone saying it out loud. She crossed her arms slowly, her posture still controlled, but her eyes sharper, now fixed on him, with something that looked less like confusion and more like challenge, like she was recalculating, like she was deciding what her next move would be. Dominic did not acknowledge her. Immediately, he spoke instead to one of the men who had returned to his side, his voice low, measured, the kind of tone that did not need to be heard to be followed. The man nodded once and moved away again, disappearing into the flow of people like a shadow slipping between light. I stood there trying to look like I belonged, like I was simply waiting for instructions from a guest, but inside everything was shifting too fast, my thoughts racing ahead of me, trying to catch up to what was happening around me. Because this was no longer just about a warning, this was something else, something larger, something that had already begun before I ever picked up that pen, and now I was standing in the middle of it, without a way out. The music continued, soft, steady, the kind of background noise that filled space without demanding attention, but now it felt distant, almost unreal, like it belonged to a different version of this room, one where everything was still normal. I became aware of how close I was to him, not physically close, but close enough that I could feel the gravity of his presence pulling everything into alignment around him. The way people moved, the way conversations shifted, the way space opened and closed as if guided by something unseen, and for the first time I realized it was not just power, it was control, refined, practiced, absolute. Dominic finally looked at me again, his gaze steady, not questioning, not uncertain, just aware, like he had already placed me somewhere in his world, and was now watching to see if I would stay there or try to move out of it. Do you understand what you did? He asked quietly, not accusing, not harsh, but direct. I hesitated just for a second, because the answer was not simple. I saved you. The words came out softer than I expected, but they were true, even if they felt too small for what had actually happened. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that made my breath catch. Because it was not gratitude, not exactly, it was recognition, like he saw the weight of the choice I had made and understood it completely. You changed more than that, he said, after a moment, his voice even lower now, and that was when I realized this was not just about him surviving. This was about everything that came after, everything that would shift because of one small decision made by someone who was never supposed to matter. And before I could even begin to process what that meant, he added one more thing, just as quietly, but with a certainty that made my pulse spike again. You do not get to step back from it now. And I felt it, then, not fear, not exactly, but the understanding settling in, deep and undeniable, that whatever line I had crossed, there was no going back to who I was before this night, and no way to pretend I had not chosen to step into his world. His words stayed with me even after he turned away, like they had weight, like they had already decided something about me that I had not fully understood, yet I stood there for a second too long before forcing myself to move again, because standing still felt like admitting I did not belong anywhere anymore, not here, not in the version of my life that existed before tonight. I stepped back into the flow of the restaurant, my body moving on instinct, my hands remembering what to do, even as my mind struggled to keep up with everything that had changed. The tray felt lighter now, or maybe I just did not notice the weight anymore, because something else had taken its place, something heavier, something permanent. I moved past tables, refilling glasses, nodding at guests who smiled and thanked me, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place around them, unaware that the man sitting 10 feet away had just redrawn the lines of a situation they would never even know existed. I caught another glimpse of his girlfriend. She had not left, not yet, but she was no longer trying to maintain the illusion of ease. Her posture was sharper, now her movements more deliberate, like she was holding on to control with both hands. Even as it slipped through her fingers, her eyes followed Dominic constantly, now not with affection, not with comfort, but with calculation, like she was trying to predict him, trying to stay one step ahead, and failing. Dominic did not look at her again, not directly, not in the way that acknowledged her presence, but everything about the way he moved, the way he positioned himself, the way the people around him adjusted, told me she had already been moved out of his world. Even if she was still physically standing in it, I felt a strange pull in my chest watching it unfold, not sympathy, not exactly, but something close to understanding, because I knew what it felt like to realize too late that something had already changed, and there was nothing you could do to reverse it. I turned toward the kitchen again, needing a moment to breathe, needing space, even though I knew space did not mean distance anymore. Not from this, not from him. The door swung open, and I stepped inside, the noise hitting me again, orders being called, dishes clattering, voices overlapping, but now it felt different, not chaotic, just contained, like even this space was part of something larger. I moved toward the sink, setting the tray down for a second longer than necessary, my fingers lingering on the edge, as I let myself take one slow breath, just one, before stepping back into motion, because stopping for too long felt dangerous now, like it would draw attention I did not want. I glanced toward the back door again. The man I had seen earlier was gone, replaced by another figure, just as still, just as out of place, and I realized this was not about who was there, it was about the pattern, the rotation, the quiet efficiency of it all. This was not random, this was controlled. I wiped my hands on a towel, even though they were not wet, just needing something to do, something to ground myself, before stepping back out into the dining room again. And the moment I did, I felt it, that pull again, that awareness, like I was being tracked, not hunted, not threatened. Just watched. Dominic stood near the exit, now speaking to one of his men, his posture relaxed, but his attention absolute, like nothing escaped him, like every detail had already been accounted for. His girlfriend was no longer beside him. She stood farther away, now near the edge of the room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable from this distance. But I could feel the tension, even without seeing her clearly, like a string pulled too tight, waiting for something to give. I hesitated for half a second before stepping forward again, because something inside me knew if I stayed back, if I tried to hide now, it would not work, not anymore. I had already been seen, already been placed somewhere in his world, and avoiding it would not change that, it would only make it worse. I moved toward him slowly, not directly, just enough to stay within reach, without making it obvious. And as I did, he turned slightly, his eyes finding mine again, not by accident, not by chance, but because he meant to, and this time there was no question in his gaze, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that made my breath catch, because it meant he had already decided what I was to him. And before I could look away, before I could step back, he spoke again, just loud enough for me to hear without anyone else noticing. You are not going back to the way things were. And something in my chest tightened, not fear, not resistance, just the undeniable truth of it. Because deep down, I already knew he was right. The moment I chose to act, the moment I chose not to stay silent, I had already left that version of my life behind, and there was no returning to it, no matter how much I might have wanted to. The words stayed with me even as I turned away, like they had rewritten something inside me that I could not undo. I moved through the restaurant again, but now every step felt different, not because the room had changed, but because I could not unsee what I had seen. I could not unknow what I now understood. This place, this night, none of it was ordinary, and neither was I anymore, not after stepping into it the way I had. Dominic remained near the exit, his presence quiet, but absolute, like a fixed point. Everything else moved around. His men shifted positions again, Not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, just enough to close gaps, to redirect space, to control the flow. Without anyone realizing it was being controlled, guests laughed, glasses clinked, someone celebrated a birthday at a table near the window. And for a moment the normalcy of it all felt surreal, like two realities were overlapping, and only I could see the difference. I forced myself to continue working, to keep my hands busy, to keep my expression neutral, because that was the only way to stay grounded. I passed table after table, offering refills, clearing plates, responding to small requests, but my attention kept pulling back to him. Like something invisible tethered me there. His girlfriend had moved again, now closer to the center of the room, but no longer beside him, no longer protected by proximity. Her posture was still composed, but the control she had earlier was gone, replaced by something sharper, something more desperate, like she was trying to hold on to a situation that had already slipped beyond her reach. I watched as she approached him slowly, her steps measured, her expression carefully arranged, as if she could rebuild whatever had broken between them with the right words at the right moment. But Dominic did not meet her halfway. He did not move toward her. He did not adjust his stance to accommodate her presence. He simply waited, and in that waiting there was something final, something that made my chest tighten, because it was not hesitation, it was conclusion. I could not hear what she said when she reached him, but I saw the way her hands moved slightly, the way her shoulders squared, like she was presenting something, offering something, explaining something, and I saw the way he listened without interruption, without reaction, like he had already heard enough long before this moment. When he finally responded, it was quiet, too quiet for anyone else to notice, but whatever he said made her freeze completely, her composure cracking for just a second before she caught it again. But that second was enough. I saw it, the realization, the understanding. The moment she knew this was over, not loudly, not publicly, but completely. She stepped back slowly, her eyes searching his face one last time, as if looking for something that was no longer there. And when she found nothing, she turned away, not running, not breaking, just walking with a control that felt forced, like she was holding herself together one step at a time, until she reached the edge of the room and disappeared into the crowd. I exhaled. Without realizing, I had been holding my breath, the tension in the room easing, not disappearing but shifting, like a storm that had passed, leaving everything changed in its wake. Dominic did not watch her leave, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I knew he was aware of it the same way he was aware of everything else in this space. I felt it again, that pull, that awareness, as his attention shifted back toward me, not directly, not immediately, but inevitably, like I had become part of the equation he had already solved. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward again, because there was no point pretending I could stay out of this now, not after everything, not after him. His eyes met mine, once more, steady, certain, and there was something different there now, something that had not been there before. Not just recognition, not just awareness, but something closer to decision. He took a step toward me, closing the distance, just enough to make it clear this was intentional, not coincidence. My pulse quickened, but I did not step back, because stepping back felt like denying something that had already been decided. You stayed, he said quietly, his voice even, but carrying that same weight as before, like each word meant more than it should. I nodded once, because leaving had never really been an option, not after he had spoken, not after I understood what staying meant. He studied me for a moment longer, and then he said something that made everything else fade into the background, something that settled deep and undeniable in my chest. Good, because now you are under my protection. And in that moment I understood protection was not just safety, it was a claim, a line drawn around me that separated my life into before and after, and there was no crossing back once it had been made. The word protection echoed in my mind long after he said it, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too well. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle over me, like something invisible but undeniable, the kind of thing you could not see but could never ignore again. I had spent my entire life staying small, staying unnoticed, staying out of situations that were not mine, and yet somehow in a single night I had stepped directly into something that was bigger than anything I had ever known. Dominic watched me like he was waiting for a reaction, like he expected resistance or fear, or maybe both. But what I felt was something else, something quieter, something steadier, like a realization unfolding piece by piece. I nodded once, not because I fully accepted it yet, but because I knew denying it would not change anything. He did not smile, he did not soften his expression, he simply acknowledged the gesture with a slight tilt of his head, like that was enough, like I had already said everything that needed to be said. Around us the restaurant continued, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had not shifted in a way that could not be undone. Conversations carried on, laughter filled the air, plates moved in and out of the kitchen, but for me, everything felt different, sharper. Clearer, like I was seeing the world through a lens I had never used before. Dominic turned slightly, speaking to one of his men, again his voice low, controlled, and within seconds the man moved away, disappearing into the flow of people, like he had a purpose already defined. I realized then that whatever had been set in motion tonight was not ending here. It was continuing beyond this room, beyond this moment, in ways I could not yet see in. Somehow I was now connected to it. I took a small step back, not away from him, but enough to breathe, enough to remind myself that I was still here, still standing, still myself. Even if everything else had changed, my shift was not over. The night was not over, but the version of me that had started this shift hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood things she had never wanted to understand. I glanced toward the entrance, the rain still falling outside, steady, relentless, like it had been all night. The city beyond the glass looked the same as it always did, busy, alive, and different. But I knew now that there were layers to it, worlds within the same streets, realities that existed side by side, and I had just crossed into one of them, without meaning to. Dominic's attention returned to me again, not demanding, not forcing, just present, like he did not need to call me closer, because I was already within his reach. "You will finish your shift," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for question, but also no urgency, like this was simply the next step in something already decided. I nodded again, because there was nothing else to do, nothing else that made sense. Finishing my shift felt almost absurd after everything that had happened, but at the same time it felt necessary, like holding on to the last piece of normal I still had. He stepped past me, then moving toward the exit, his presence drawing subtle attention without ever demanding it. His men adjusted, instantly falling into place around him, not in a tight formation, not in a way that would alarm anyone, just enough to create space, just enough to guide movement, without anyone realizing they were being guided. He paused just before the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle, and for a moment I thought he would leave without another word, without another glance. But then he turned slightly, his eyes finding mine across the room. "One last time tonight, everyone in this room played a role," he said, his voice low, but carrying across the distance in a way that felt deliberate, like it was meant only for me. "Except you." He paused just long enough for the words to settle, just long enough for me to feel the meaning behind them, before adding something else, something quieter, but far more final. "That is why you matter now." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, the sound barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me it felt like something had sealed, like a chapter had ended and another had begun. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, the noise of the restaurant rushing back and around me, the weight of everything pressing down all at once. And I realized something that made my breath catch, not because it scared me, but because it was true. I did not just step into his world tonight, I changed my place in it. And there was no version of my life where I walked away unchanged anymore.